It is.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah. 2 people, 3. That makes it a little bit better. We'll still hold on for a minute or more.
I have started the recording.
Well done.
Well done, Kirsty.
We edit this bit out, so it's fine.
Yeah. Say what you like.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure about that.
Oh. It was nice to have you with us, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, looking forward to it. Good.
4 people. That's good. Let's we'll wait a minute or 2 more, and just probably when it gets to 10, it'll be okay to open it up, I think. Let's hope we do get to 20, though. That would be nice.
Yes, we never know. We haven't laid bets, have we?
We haven't. No, that's what we normally do. You're right. Kirsty normally wins.
Yes, yes, she does.
I'm going 20.
I'm going 16.
Kirsty's going 16.
Oh, she was nose. 18.
Oh, I'm going to go 22.
Ah.
Although I have to say early signs are not promising, but
yeah. Yes. 58. Catherine Johnson.
how many did you get at the last one?
Kirsty.
I'd have to check.
I think we had something like 70 signed up and we got about 40 or something around that number. So it's definitely a smaller sign up and number.
It's a new term as well, and
yeah,
we've been through the 4 practices, haven't we?
We have. So, yeah.
I mean, not 4, 7.
In
4 webinars.
We knew what you meant. We knew what you meant. Here's another
blocking in now.
Okay, I think why don't we, let's open up. Okay, Kirsty, open up. And then we've only got about a minute until we need to start. Di.
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Lovely to see you all. Lovely to see you all.
Morning.
Morning, welcome.
Good morning, good morning. We'll be starting in just under a minute. Great to see you. Do, if you've got a second, say hello in the chat. Tell us where you're from. And what's the question we were exploring this morning, Di, in the chat?
Oh, yeah, well, we were thinking, wouldn't it, where it's like autumn now and the colours are going. So favourite place for an autumn sort of, where would you go for an autumn walk, your favourite place?
Yeah.
I live just next door to a field, and this whole row of trees, so I'll just take my dog there, and it's perfect.
Okay, that's quite limiting. I'm thinking, where in the country could I go?
Oh, all right then, go on.
So Lake District, I would go for a nice autumn walk, I think.
Okay. Don't worry. Yeah, I see your message there, Sarah. Don't worry. Just tap away in the chat if you want to say something.
Yeah. That's, I think, where I would go. So Di, I reckon we should probably get going.
Okay. No more chat about autumn walks.
I think we should start. It's 12 o'clock. Let's crack on.
Okay. Oh, saw that in a minute. Welcome everyone. Really good to see you, and especially as it's a new term and everything else, and so many busy things happening. We're so grateful you've taken the time out, and we really hope that you'll find this really helpful, and that it'll be something that you can take away that is just for you. So this is the 5th in our series of how to nurture a faith sharing culture webinars. I'm Di Archer, and we're looking forward to interacting with you. And actually we were thinking, if there's fewer of us, it might actually, we could just chill, and rather than putting questions in the chat, maybe we'll unmute later on. There will be opportunity to ask questions, what I'm really trying to say. So CPAS, I guess, hopefully you all know about CPAS, but if you don't, we're an Anglican evangelical mission agency, and we seek to resource church leaders to lead churches in mission well throughout the UK and Northern Ireland. We run Christian holidays as well for children and young people, and we also act as patrons for over 690 churches now. So where they need a new vicar, we're involved in that process for many of them. You can find out more about us on our website, and there's a link to in the chat to that. So I've also got two others here. So James, who are you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. James Lawrence, work along with Di at CPAS, oversee our leadership development work, and really looking forward to spending the time with you.
And Sarah, you're joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself too?
Yep. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you this morning. I'm Sarah, and until a couple of weeks ago, I was team rector of a benefice in Dorset, in Ferndown, for those of you who know that part of the world. But as of the last 2 weeks, I've been on the team, the leadership team at CPAS.
So yeah, so that's really fun to have Sarah on board with us, and we're looking forward to hearing more of your experience, Sarah, and what you can share with us. That'd be really good. So thanks for joining us this morning. And as you know, these webinars are based on the book. And if you missed the previous 4 webinars, they explored each of the 7 core shifts that we talk about in the book, the faith sharing book. And there are recordings of these, of previous webinars, available on web pages, along with a range of additional materials. So James, where can people find those?
So there's a link in the chat, and actually we'll say a bit more about that at the end of the webinar and point people in the right direction for all the things that they'd like to look at.
Oh, okay, thank you. And today we've got a further resource to introduce to you, and also we're going to think a little more about how to nurture a culture where people tell stories of what God has done for them and they feel okay about that. It's an okay thing to do. So as we go along, as I said, if you've got any comments for the moment, just put them in the chat, but we'll hopefully be able to unmute and chat a bit later on. So James, just before we start, let me pray. Dear Father, we thank you that you are a faithful God, faithful through all the ups and downs, the challenges, the joys, the pains, and we thank you that you take us step by step, that you have redeemed us and we belong to you. So we pray for these next few minutes that each one of us will meet with you in some way or another, and that your Spirit will speak to each one of us for our own sake, but also, Lord, for that longing that we have that more people would get to know your faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, James, over to you.
As you're probably aware, we quite like to do some polls just to gather a bit of information and knowledge around what's going on. And so I'm going to launch a poll, and hopefully you'll be able to respond to it. Here goes the poll. We're just wanting to get a bit of information about the practices. We've got these 7 core shifts, 7 practices that are embedded into the heart of the resource, and we're encouraging churches to engage with. And we'd love you just to let us know how you're doing on these practices. So you'll see that each practice is listed with 4 options, and just take a moment to let us know whether you've considered it, not considered it, got started early days, or been doing it for a while. And I'm always aware with polls, there's always 1 or 2 folks whose devices won't let them do polls. So apologies for those of you who can't, but for those of you who can, just scroll through and tick away, and it'll just be helpful for us to get a bit of a sense of what people are up to or not up to. And I'll be quiet for a moment while you do that. You'll just need to scroll down through the different questions. So there's 7 different questions for each of the practices. Now, of course, this presumes you've read the book or been along to the other webinars.
Indeed.
And if you haven't, you're just going to be going, I can't answer these questions, which is fine. Don't panic. They're not a problem at all. We're just going to give a moment or two more. About half of us have finished the poll. I'll just give a few more moments for the rest of us to do that. Mike, interesting comment. I found I needed we have done this in the past, but have taken our eye off the ball button. Fair point, Mike. Yeah, get that entirely. We might chat a bit more about that later on. It's a really helpful insight. And Sarah said she agrees too in the chat. Really helpful. Just a few more moments while we wait for those last ones to come in. Ian needs to catch up. That's fine. Not a problem. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and let me just share the results so you can get a little sense of where we're at. And again, you can scroll through to see the answers. First practice, engage with God in your churches. This is where we're trying to encourage people to develop in their own relationship with Jesus, because of course the sharing of faith is the overflow of our own following of Jesus, and we've got a bit of a spread there. Practice 2, pray for 5, which is one many churches will have been doing because of Thy Kingdom Come, making that very popular. It actually existed, predated Thy Kingdom Come, but again, interesting just to see the spread that there are there. Number 3, refocus your intercessions in your churches. This is this very simple idea of ensuring that we're praying about faith sharing on a regular basis as part of our Sunday intercessions. We always pray about the sick or the government, but what about praying about how we're doing in terms of sharing faith? And again, some variety there. Practice 4, which is we're going to talk about a little bit more today. There's less folks involved in doing that as yet, so it's probably good. We're going to talk a bit more about that today. Practice 5, telling faith stories. Again, one we're going to be focusing on today, and a bit more of a spread there. Practice 6, resource faith sharing in your churches. Less got started with that one, and less with practice 7 as well. That's really helpful, really interesting information, and helpful for us just to see where you're at. So thanks so much for doing that. What we want to do initially this morning is just to spend some time talking to Sarah. So Sarah, join me as it were, and unmute. Great. And we're just going to find a little bit about what Sarah has done in her context to encourage the telling of faith stories. So Sarah, can I start off by just saying, tell us a little bit about the churches that you served in.
Yeah, so as I said, we were based in Burndown in Dorset, and I oversaw 2 parishes within that town. One of them, Hampreston, All Saints Hampreston, was a smaller, lively, rural church, and then we had a larger town centre church in the centre of Burndown. Great.
And you were telling me about how you put quite a lot of energy and effort into sort of developing a storytelling culture within the life of the church. Why did you think that that was important?
Well, actually, the rural church, All Saints, had quite a culture of telling stories anyway. I don't know whether this was because it was a smaller environment, and so it felt a little bit easier for people to have courage to share their stories. But most weeks during the service, at some point, someone would get up and share something of what God had been doing in their lives. And sometimes that was related to how they came to faith. And sometimes it was a current story of something God had been doing in the last week, or an answer to prayer, or a verse of scripture that they had been encouraged by. And I can really see the fruit of this in the congregation. I can see how it was really building faith, and how it was equipping people as well to be able to share their story outside of the church building. And I thought, I wonder if this is going to be possible in a larger environment. So I really could see the benefit and was sort of hungry to try and introduce that in the larger church.
And so how did you try and go about that in the larger context?
Well, that church was sort of multi-congregation. We had an all-age service that met every week called Breakfast Church. We had a more traditional service, and we also had a kind of a family service where everyone was in together, and children then went out for children's work midway through the service. And I use a slightly different approach in each of those services. So initially, in our sort of main service where children were in at the beginning and then went out, I would often give people a little bit of warning. So I would say, a little later in our service, we're going to have an opportunity for you to share something that might encourage others, or something that God has been doing in your life, or a good news story, or words to that effect. And that gave a little bit of a heads up that this was coming their way, and gave people the opportunity to have a think about it. And sometimes it was a bit awkward and stilted, and nobody said anything. In which case, you know, as the leader, you have the responsibility to then help carry the congregation through that moment.
Yeah.
And it does take a little bit of courage and risk as the leader, because you never quite know what's going to come up. But it's sort of, it gathered momentum. And once people had heard one or two stories, it became just part of what we do. And so I no longer needed to warn people this was coming up in the service. I could just spring it upon them, but they knew that it was likely to happen. And so they were ready for that. In the more traditional service, I took a slightly different approach. And so I would actually talk to someone. Either they had come to me in conversation and said, you never guess what happened to me last week, or you'll never guess this conversation I had with my neighbor, or, you know, they shared something with me. And then I would say, you know, would you be willing to share something in the service? And so for some people, I gave them sort of 3 or 4 questions just to prompt them as to how they might share within the service. And then we arranged the front of church so that we had both had a comfy chair, and I would interview them and ask them to share something. And some of those stories were, you know, there was nothing spectacular in some of those stories. It was just about, you know, regular Christian life, doing the stuff we do, and but how faith had enriched or strengthened them through different seasons of their lives. And people were really able to relate to that and grab hold of it. And the number of people who came up afterwards to say how encouraged they'd been to hear one of their brothers and sisters share very simply about what God had done. So different approaches. And again, in the all age service.
Yeah, tell us about the all age. What did you do there?
Yes. Well, I just wanted the children to feel comfortable and confident in sharing what God was doing with them. Now, I had a secret weapon because I've got 2 daughters who are fairly confident. And so sometimes they would share with me something that God had done. And I would say, I think people at Breakfast Church would love to hear about that. Would you be willing to share? And sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. But again, if you can prime 1 or 2 people to begin to share something of what God's been doing, that can be really helpful. And again, just doing that regularly then just fits that into the culture of the church, of the congregation. But even when the children were going out for groups in our other service, I really wanted them to be in to hear these stories, because I think children and young people really relate well and engage with hearing other people's experiences. So that became a really important part of that service.
Sarah, that's really helpful. In the resource, we talk about a particular type of way that we want to encourage people to tell faith stories, which is actually the telling of the story of how they came to faith. What was the blend or balance between stories of what God has recently been doing, either this week, this month, and actually encouraging people to tell the story of how they came to faith?
Yes. We really mixed it up a bit, because I felt it was really important that people knew that it wasn't just, well, I became a Christian 20 years ago, but since that I haven't really heard from God. And, you know, everybody had some story of what God was doing currently. So that was really good. But particularly in the more traditional service, when I was asking questions, I would always include the question, can you tell me about how you came to faith? What was significant for you? Who were the people involved? Those sorts of questions. And that helped people to rehearse a little bit how they might share their story with those who weren't in church. So I think that was very valuable from that point of view. And then in the sort of the bigger service where there was given more sort of free rein to people so they could share anything, generally speaking, people were sharing stories of what God had done recently, but often it would relate back to what God had been doing throughout their lives. So there was a link back to that time when they came to faith.
So one of the reasons you introduced this was because you saw the impact it was having in your smaller congregation, your rural church, and thought it would be helpful to see if that could be replicated. Did that happen? What sort of impact did it have in the other church? I
think, without sort of over egging it, I think it's probably one of the most significant changes to our pattern of worship that I've introduced in the last 5 years. It really had a big impact. I think it really raised faith in the congregation. I think it really built confidence. I think often people would come to me saying, oh, I have had exactly that situation in my life, and if God could do it for them, then he can do it for me. And that's really helped. But I think also there's been a vulnerability that has grown relationship within the church. So people have been willing to share when things haven't been straightforward, when there have been really big struggles and difficult times. And one lady comes to mind in particular who shared how she prayed for her husband every day for 26 years that he would come to know Jesus. And finally, actually shortly before he died, he gave his life to the Lord. And that obviously was a huge and incredible, a wonderful answer to prayer. But it just also showed the need for kind of perseverance, how you go on trusting God when you don't see immediate answers. And there were many other people in the congregation who could relate to that situation, who've been praying for their, unsaved family or friends, and who kind of, some of them had felt like, why am I bothering? Why am I doing this? And that just spurred them on to keep going. So that's just one example of the impact that it's had.
Thank you. And I'm sure many of us also, if I can just wind back to a moment ago, are sitting here thinking, when nobody says anything, what do you actually do? So give us a tip. When actually there's a silence in the congregation, nobody's volunteering anything, how did you handle that?
Yeah, I think really I just said, there will be an opportunity at a later date if something comes to mind, because sometimes people would be sitting there trying to pluck up courage. And sometimes there's sometimes been a case where people have wanted to write something down and then come back later. So telling people that they haven't missed the boat, I think, is very helpful. And I think, you know how it is when you're leading worship, you have the opportunity to make that space or silence not an awkward thing, but just a regular, normal thing. And just being able to say, that's no problem, we can do this again another time, has really helped. I think probably slightly more difficult is if somebody says something which you think, oh gosh, that wasn't exactly, it may not be altogether helpful. And that happens as well from time to time, not that often actually, but I had one time where somebody stood up and said, why isn't this church doing more to help the refugees from Ukraine? And it wasn't the time or the place. So I think the way that you introduce that slot is quite important, and you can sort of feed ideas to people of the sort of things that would be appropriate to share in that time. But then often if something has come up that hasn't sat very comfortably with what's been going on in the worship, I basically turned it into prayer and taken the opportunity to lead the congregation in prayer, and we've moved on from that slot. Brilliant.
So so helpful, Sarah, because the two sort of practices in how to nurture a faith sharing culture this relates to is one is telling faith stories, and the reason why we focused on that in the book and encouraging churches to embed that into the life of the church, you've beautifully demonstrated it brings encouragement that God is at work in people's lives, in the past in the way that he helped them to come to faith, but also in the present in terms of their daily lives. And that helps people to believe that he might do some things in other people's lives in the future. So that's excellent. And then the other little practice is this thing about practicing faith conversations. And of course, as I listened to you, part of what you were doing is you were giving people a space to actually articulate something of their faith and practice it in a relatively safe environment in order that they might get a bit more familiar to having God language on their lips before they might speak about it outside of the life of the gathered church. Sarah, that's really helpful. We're going to come back to Sarah a bit later on. If you'd like to ask us some other questions or ask her some questions, you'll be able to do that. Di, we're going to move on to the second little thing we wanted to do before we come to the Q&A time.
Yeah, so as usual, James has come up with another new resource. James, what is this? Tell us about it and why it's going to be, useful for everyone.
So as you'll be aware, we're trying to create a whole suite of resources that might help a community of practice around the country as we seek to enable faith sharing, and little things that we are trying to create to do that. And the one we've come up with is a little survey. This may not sound terribly exciting, but hold on, I think it could be really helpful. It's a very simple survey, which is about the obstacles or the struggles that people have when it comes to sharing their faith. Now, we've actually trialed this with a whole bunch of churches already, The survey is so simple that it can be done in 2 minutes in a congregational context. So whatever congregations you've got, you can give each person an A5 piece of paper and a pencil. They can do the survey in 2 minutes, and then you can collate the results. What's fascinating is what results people are getting back, because a number of churches we've done this with, the church leader thought they knew what would be top of the list of the obstacles that people have when it came to sharing their faith. And in nearly every instance, the obstacle they thought would be top of the list was not top of the list. And that insight alone is worth the survey, because then when you know what the obstacle is, you as a church leader can think, what can we do about it? How do we actually help people with this particular struggle that they might have? Now, if you're trying to think out what might be some of those obstacles, it's a whole range of things, very simple, the things that you'll know of. For some people, their main struggle when it comes to sharing the faith is fear about how people will respond, rejection, disinterest, that sort of thing. For other people, their obstacle when it comes to sharing their faith may be, I'm not really sure I've got a faith to share. For another person, it might be, I do have a faith to share, but I don't feel confident in articulating something about my faith. For other people, it will be, I don't actually have any people that I have much contact with who aren't Christians. I spend all my time in, you get the idea. There's a whole range of things. And we've created this little survey on the basis of Fulan's theory of change. Now, I did mention this in a previous webinar, so I won't say a lot about it now. But Fulan is the guy who came up with a very interesting theory of change. And his theory of change is basically this. In any change scenario, there are going to be things that are working against change happening. And then there'll be things you're doing to try and help the change to happen. And his thesis is this, that very often what you need is to release the handbrakes that are holding things back before you press the accelerator that would make things go forward. And basically, this survey is saying, what are the handbrakes that are in our congregation? What are the things that are preventing people from moving forward? And once you've got that bit of information, then you can do something about it.
So what format does this come in, this survey?
Two formats. There's a very simple PDF. You can print off the survey and give them a paper copy. The other format is an online survey where you can use something like Google Docs or some online way of doing it. And there are pros and cons for both. One of the things I think keys to this is to try and get as many people in your congregation to complete the survey as possible. So actually doing it over a couple of gatherings for your, whenever that congregation might meet, midweek or on a Sunday, doing it over a couple of weeks, because we all know regular attendance these days equals once every fortnight or once every 3 weeks. So do it over whatever regular attendance looks like in your context, so you can get as many people to do as possible. And actually, paper version, I know it's very old school, but actually you're most likely to get the majority of people doing it if you do it when they're present. An online one, well, that will mean that some people might not be able to access that. You might have an email distribution list you can send it to, but actually not everybody will be on that. So you're going to minimize the number of people that will actually do the survey. And also, if you send it out as a link online, statistically, a small proportion will actually do it. Even if you send it to 50 people, you'll probably only get 10 or 15 that will do it. The advantage of the online one is it does all the collation of the information for you. The disadvantage of the paper one is you actually then have to just collate the results, which will take a little bit of time. But we've created an Excel spreadsheet that you can collate those results into to make the whole process a little bit easier. And then you'll have some sort of statistical analysis breakdown of what the results are in your context.
So once you've kind of worked out, identified obstacles, then what?
So then you need to address the obstacle, do something about it, help your people with actually facing that obstacle and working out what to do about it. And this is a bit naughty maybe, but our next webinar, we're going to talk a lot more about how to do that and give you some really practical ideas about what to do to address some of those struggles. The reality is you'll come up with those ideas yourself. Just take 10 minutes with your top obstacle and think, with a couple of other people that you share leadership with, church wardens, PCC members, elders, whatever it might be, take 10, 15 minutes just to sit down and say, well, what could we do about this? And honestly, you'll come up with some really good ideas in a 10 to 15-minute conversation, and then put into practice some of those practical ideas, and actually you'll begin to help people release those handbrakes.
So how do we get hold of this survey?
So we're going to send it to you, and we'll also put it online as well. So you'll get it after probably tomorrow morning, I would think, when we send out the follow-up email, and we'll send you the 2 documents, and you can then have a little look at it and see if that might be a tool. Like all these things, like, we're just trying to create a suite of little things that might additionally help us as we seek to nurture a faith sharing culture. And this is just one of a whole series of other things that we've done.
Okay, thanks, James. Your obstacles survey, identifying obstacles. Thank you. Okay, I'd love to do it. I'm not a church leader, but I'd love to do it in my church, and be really, it'd be really interesting. And I've got some questions also from the things that you and Sarah both said, but I want to throw it open now. And if you want to either put a question in a chat for James or Sarah, or raise a hand and virtual hand or whatever, then let's ask some questions. So let's start with Ian then. Yeah, Ian, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, yeah. Thanks for that survey idea, James. That sounds fantastic. I really looking forward to that one. When we've done faith sharing thing, we've done it a few times. And I remember a lady standing up, and she'd just been healed of cancer and was obviously full of joy and sharing that with enthusiasm. But I was conscious, just like the other side of the church was a family who had just grieving someone who died of cancer. How would you handle that?
Great question, Ian. Sarah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and of course that is going to happen probably most times when people share. In a larger community, you're going to have people for whom that is very much still a live issue, those who have not seen the answers to prayer that they would want to have seen, and those who are celebrating. And I think it's really difficult. And again, I think it's important that we celebrate the good things that God has done, and not allow our kind of concerns about others who haven't seen that yet to take away from that sense of joy and celebration and wonderful news that family is experiencing. So I would be really keen to celebrate that. But then again, very often after someone has shared, not every time, but very often, I would lead us all in prayer. And sometimes it would be prayer because that person had an ongoing issue that they were coping with. So sometimes people were sharing in the midst of a situation, and we would pray that the Lord would continue to move in that situation. But I would also use it as an opportunity to pray for those who haven't seen that answer that they are longing for yet as well, and asking the Lord to draw near to them and encourage and help them in the midst of their, still being in the valley. So that's one thing that you can do. But sometimes I've said as well, I remember one time somebody sharing that they'd been healed of arthritis in their back. And it was a wonderful testimony of kind of a really quite extraordinary miracle. And I did suggest that perhaps if there were others struggling with that issue in the congregation, that they might ask this person who shared their testimony to pray for them afterwards. Because again, that person has faith then to see that mountain move. And so they would be kind of often very willing and open to praying then for others who are going through a similar situation. But it is one where, as the leader of the service, you do need to exercise quite a lot of discernment and sensitivity to what others are experiencing.
Sarah, have you ever used that lovely little phrase from the scriptures about how, as the people of God, we learn to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, and that in different parts of a service we might be doing different aspects of that? So here's an occasion for us to rejoice with those who are rejoicing, but in other parts of the service we'll weep with those who are weeping, as we, for example, intercede for them in the prayers of intercession in their valley experience. And I think I love that phrase, because I think it's an encouragement to us as the people of God to do both those things.
Yeah, that's so helpful, isn't it? And it is really important that that's part of being the people of God together. But also, I think, we do celebrate those really extraordinary good news stories, but we also people share things that are not so victorious where they haven't seen the end of the story yet. And I think that that's really important as well, that we enable and encourage people to share those things where they haven't seen, you know, the answers that they would like yet, but they're continuing to trust the Lord in that situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Did you, carry on, Ian?
Yeah, I just wanted to, that's really helpful. And I think that's right. I was just beginning to think, I wonder what the impact this would have on both optimists and pessimists, because people can see the same situation. Obviously, a healing of a miracle, whatever, is a big one extreme, but optimists can see something always positive. And I just wonder, by doing this, actually, it might teach both not to be so ridiculously optimistic, I say as a pessimist, and to cheer me up and make me think more positively about prayer. So. Thank you.
And I like Mike's comment as well. Thanks, Mike, in the chat. Also got stories of people who've not seen a miracle or answered prayer, but actually their faith is being strengthened through it nonetheless. That's so helpful.
Yes. Yes, it's that thing of Jesus walking with us always, isn't it, through everything. Yeah, more questions for James or Sarah? While you're thinking about it, I've got a couple. I want some practical things, Sarah. So does it depend what gathering you're talking about as to how long you would allow for this? And what do you do if someone looks like they're going to go on for about half an hour?
Yes. Yeah, that sometimes happens, and it's part of the risk that you take. But I think I've sometimes laid a gentle hand on somebody's shoulder, just as an indication that perhaps, you know, that's been really helpful. But that's kind of more than we don't need to hear any more about it. And it's part of it's just how you curate that. Sometimes as well, we have had sort of 4 or 5 people wanting to share, and sometimes we've had to say, you know, I'm really sorry, we don't have time to hear more today, but we would love to hear it again at another opportunity. It's you're sort of thinking on your feet, and sometimes it's felt right to allow someone to go on a little bit longer and to make the service feel, you know, a little bit longer than it would have been, but there was something really important that they needed to share, that there were those in the congregation that day who needed to hear it. So there's just a little bit of wisdom that is required as you throw open this opportunity. And we certainly found that as sort of momentum built, more and more people were wanting to share something, which is great. But yeah, again, you just need to be a little bit wise in how long you allow people to speak for. And sometimes I would say as well, you know, just give us a minute or two about what God's been doing for you. So I would sort of frame it at the beginning, how long was going to be available.
Sarah's asking a question. What about recording these days? So do you stop recording when people are sharing, you know, all the complicated GDPR stuff? This
was something I was really concerned about when we went to live streaming our services. Mostly through lockdown, we pre-recorded services, and then we took the decision as we were sort of in that grey period where we were sort of in lockdown and out of lockdown, and people were kind of drifting back to church, that we would live stream. And I really was concerned, would this close down the sort of faith sharing and story sharing culture that we were seeking to grow? And we found that it didn't. So the key thing is that everybody in the church knows that this service is being live streamed. And so if they know that, then they recognize that if they come forward, then that will be broadcast to others. So I think that's the key thing. And obviously at the beginning of our service, we would always welcome those joining us online and things like that. So there are lots of indications, even if you didn't know that that was our regular practice, that this was going to go out to a wider audience. But it's been fascinating how people haven't felt inhibited by that. And that's been a real surprising joy for me in going on to a live stream.
Rob, what's your question?
Thanks, Sarah, for your sharing your experiences. I wondered whereabouts in the services you placed the sharing of testimonies and what impact that might have on preaching and how you might, where it came and how you might pick up on things that had been shared.
Yes, I would often do it quite early on in the service, actually. for fairly practical reasons. One, because as I said, I often wanted the children to be in for that part of the service. But also sometimes people would just, stew a little bit about, I know I've got to get up and say something, but if they had to wait to the end of the service, it just meant that they were a little bit preoccupied with that. So sometimes, again, from a very practical perspective, having it early on would be helpful. And then often, Rob, as you've kind of picked out, often there would be some link with what was coming up in the teaching, and that was always a wonderful thing. It's easier if you are leading and preaching, but if you're sharing in it with a colleague as well, it was often wonderful to be able to pick up on something someone had shared in that story sharing section in the service as illustrative material, really, for something that you were bringing later in the service. But we found that on the whole, earlier on, would be helpful. Sometimes in the all-age service, we would do it towards the end as part of a response to what had been shared. But generally speaking, we had it fairly early on in the service.
Thank you.
Anne.
A very practical question here. Where do people do their testimony from? I mean, ours is physically quite a small church, and I can imagine people would be happy staying in their pew, certainly early on in doing this. But then you've got the problem of whether they're heard. So the feeling of people having to come to the front and do it sort of might put people off. I just wonder how you'd done that.
There's some really great questions coming out. Thank you. I think that's very important to think about, actually. Again, our more traditional congregation, we had a number of people for whom mobility was a big issue, and some in our kind of more informal congregation as well. And so sometimes, if you have the technology, we had a roving mic that I would take down, and sometimes people would request that, and they say, "Oh, can I stay in my seat and just share from here?" In that case, I'd make sure we got a microphone to them. And sometimes they would stand. I think that was helpful. If they were able to stand in their space, then that was great. But to be able to have that option of a roving mic was very helpful in that. And at other times, people were happy to come to the front and share from the front. And sometimes we set the stage a bit by having a couple of chairs. So where we had one of those conversations where I'd ask someone in advance if they would be happy to share, we would set the stage with a couple of chairs to do it sort of, I always called it Parky style, that one, like Parkinson, a little kind of chat show version. So again, you can adapt this to your context and to the people that you know will be in your congregation to enable as many people who want to be able to share.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. So yeah, I feel like we could talk a bit more about this, the practical things, but
Mike would love to ask a question. He's just got his hand up.
Oh, has he? Oh,
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay.
2 quick questions.
Sorry, Mike.
That's okay. Thank you. 2 quick questions. You may not have time for them. One's directed at James. Number one, how do you keep going when things dry up? When it just dries up, how do you keep going as a leader? Quite, typically poorly resourced. Number 2, James, is lost for words still relevant? So I just throw those questions in.
Great. Those are 2 big questions. I'll take the latter one first. I'll have to give fairly short answers because time is slowly ticking away, but fairly short answers. Is lost for words still relevant today? Yes and no. The context in which we're sharing our faith today is a different context to the one that Lost for Words was written in. So that means that we need to approach the sharing of faith in some different ways. The context that Lost for Words was written in was one where the predominant culture was a guilt-orientated culture. We're now in a shame-orientated culture. So how you share the good news of Jesus in a shame-orientated culture is different to a guilt-orientated culture, just to give one little example. However, lots of the practices and principles are very similar. So there's a yes and no to Lost for Words. I wasn't quite sure about your first question, Mike, whether that was about how to keep going personally when you're sort of struggling, or as a church when you're...
I think as a leader, and I was really hearing piggybacking off what Sarah was saying before, like when she's moving stuff around, but then I was thinking, people dry up very fast, and how as a leader do you keep that on the go, on boiling?
Yeah, That's a massive question. A very short answer to a big question would be, inevitably in your life, there will be fluctuations in your own spiritual journey, fluctuations in terms of your sense of God's presence, your faith level, your excitement and passion for what God has called you to. Inevitably, there will be those fluctuations. And I think part of the maturing of a leader is working out how to lead well wherever you are in that up and down journey that we all go through. We do quite a lot of stuff around resilience, around vocation and orderliness to try and help leaders with that very issue, because it's inevitable. It's inevitable. So I think one of the keys is don't beat yourself up too much if you find yourself in a period where you're not feeling quite as excited as you used to. It won't always be like that, hopefully.
Thank you, James. Sarah, is it possible you could answer yes or no to these? Did you find that sitting down meant that people's stories took longer, you know, the whole thing took longer?
Yes, it could.
Okay.
And yes or no, it's hard.
Yeah. Did you have a faith sharing opportunity in every service?
Almost every service.
Almost every service. Okay, thank you. Okay, if you don't mind, we'll just move on now, because I just wanted to say, if you haven't yet got your free copy of the book and you're eligible for that, or you know people who are, do go and have a look for it at this link, because the free copies are really going down now. We haven't got many left. Our kind donor paid for 3,000 of them and we haven't got many left now. So that was one thing. Or you can purchase them, of course, everyone, then they'll all be purchasable always. But James, what about the online stuff? Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, we've got a bunch. Has that come up on the screen, Di?
Yep.
Yeah, great. We've got a whole bunch of stuff that we are putting online, both related to the webinars we've done previously. So if you just go to the link that's in the chat /77, cps.org.uk/77, you can just look at all these different things. So here are the webinars that we've done and extra resources around each of the 7 practices. So there's videos, extra materials, or a whole variety of different stuff that's up there. So do make use of the extra resources. And as you have ideas, please let us know those ideas, because we'd love to share them with others. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to build this sort of community of good practice, where together we're resourcing one another in helping our churches to be churches where there's a faith sharing culture. We know culture change normally takes years, not weeks or months. So we're on a journey together where we're trying to resource each other in an ongoing way. So plenty of materials there for you to have a look at. Do make use of those.
Yeah, do. There's lots of brilliant stuff out of the mind of James Lawrence there that you don't want to miss, because they're very, very helpful. And James, we've also got a new series of training events on leading in evangelism. Can you tell us a bit about them too?
Yeah, and again, just sharing my screen for a moment. Mike, the question you asked about loss of words, the very next thing we're doing is on the 1st of November, and it's about the 3 keys to making sense of evangelism today, where we're looking at how do you make sense of evangelism in the sort of context we now find ourselves in today? Because our little thesis is this: quite a lot of churches are still doing evangelism with a 1950s, 60s model of evangelism, or even a 1990s model of evangelism. And we're not in the 1950s or the 1990s, we're in 2022. And so we're going to do something on 3 keys to making sense of evangelism. And then there's a whole range. This is a little series we're doing. 5 ways to nurture a faith-sharing culture, 4 principles for creating pathways to faith, 5 insights to help you equip your congregation to share their faith. They're rolling throughout this academic year, right the way through until June, 28th of June. So do sign up for those and let others know about them, because we think we've probably got some things that might be helpful for folks as we have been exploring this whole area of evangelism today.
Thank you so much. We're just going to run a little bit over time today, but I hope that's okay, because it's been good stuff that we've been talking about. But we would love to just give you a minute now to think about your own next steps with this practice. There is a couple of questions to reflect on in the chat there. Just to give you literally a minute, which of the core practices might it be good to focus on? Almost like your instant reaction, your instinctive response to that. What could I do to nurture a storytelling culture, and when could we introduce the obstacle survey? I mean, obviously, this isn't the last opportunity to think about it, but it's so good to capture your instinctive reactions, I think, to things. Thank you for that. Our next steps are to keep in touch with you, I guess, about what's coming up next, and to get some more new ideas coming your way. And please, as James just said, do get in touch if you've got things to share that would help other people. So James, just say again, what is next?
So the next webinar in the How to Nurture a Face Sharing series, we will be exploring a little bit about how to deal with those obstacles, how to help people overcome those obstacles from the survey. And secondly, it's going to be an opportunity for us to try and address any questions you'd like to ask us at this stage. So in just a moment, we're going to launch a feedback form, as we always do for all these webinars. And one of the questions is a very simple one, which says, have you got a particular thing you think it would be helpful for us to address? And we'd love to get your ideas from that.
Brilliant, thank you. So should we do the feedback poll now?
Yeah, and I think probably what to say, we apologise, we've gone a couple of minutes over. If you need to go, please do. But there is just a very quick little bit of feedback we'd love to get from you. 4 questions, which I've just launched. And if you've got a moment just to do those. And one of them was, what question about nurturing a face sharing culture would you like us to address on the next webinar? That would be great. And maybe we can pray as people are doing that, and then let folks finish that off as we head towards the end of our time, Di.
Okay, yeah, sure. And James and Sarah, thank you so much, especially Sarah. Really, really good to hear of your encouragement and the things that have happened there for you. Sorry, my fault. Somebody expecting me to be on time. Silly. Yeah, thank you both very much, and let me pray. Father, it is your kingdom, not ours, that you are building, and we get to be involved in that. And what an incredible privilege that is, and also so challenging on other days. So we just pray that for each of our contexts and situations, you will build your kingdom here. And that you will just nudge us in the right direction so that you can do that. Give us the next steps, Lord. You are the Lord, and we thank you for your faithfulness. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you for doing this poll. Is it, nearly through?
That's great. And as always, we're going to stick around for the next few minutes. If you've got other questions you'd like to ask or want to chat further about anything, we'd be very happy to do that, wouldn't we, Di?
Absolutely.
And then obviously, if you need to skip off to other things, hope to see you at the next webinar. We'll send you the link in an email tomorrow for that, or at any of the other events that we're doing. Sarah, I had a question I wanted to just ask you, if you don't mind. You were talking about doing this in pretty much every service. How do you keep it fresh?
Well, I was reflecting on Mike's question earlier, actually, about what do you do if things dry up? And I was thinking in terms of, okay, maybe the first few weeks you do this, people will have something to share, and then after that they'll be like, no one will have anything to share. But God's always doing new things, and it's one of those wonderful surprises that you find as you embark on this adventure, really, that you discover that God is always on the move. And so people do generally have things to share. I think, you know, if you're doing it in a slightly more formal context, you can keep it fresh by the sorts of questions that you ask people, and, you know, helping people to think currently about the difference faith is making in their day-to-day lives, asking people about where they are on Monday morning and how their faith works for them as the rubber hits the road in a kind of a sometimes difficult context. Those sorts of questions can really help. But I didn't feel that there was a lot of need for me to, you know, there was always something for people to share. And that was one of the really exciting things about this whole journey for us. And in fact, momentum grew rather than the other way around.
Excellent. That's so helpful. So helpful. And I know lots of churches have used this time tomorrow as a way of sort of doing this as well. And that's another way I think one can inject a slightly different angle on the same sort of dynamic, just by getting people to the 4 key questions that LICC encourage people to ask. So really helpful.
And did you ever, when you started it, Sarah, did you ever have any kickback?
I don't think so. And one of the beautiful things about this is that it does translate across every kind of context and community and culture, really, because people are endlessly interested in other people. Yes. And also, you know, people are really encouraged by hearing. I love reading stories of kind of great men and women of God who've done extraordinary exploits. I love those. I find them really encouraging. But I think, again, the fact that it's so relatable means that it's very transferable, that you can do this anywhere and find that it bears fruit and has good benefits for people. Yeah, both those who tell their story and those who hear the stories.
Thanks, Mike.
I missed that.
Okay. Yeah, he's put a note in the chat.
Oh,
It could stay all day. Yeah. Well, it's such important stuff, and that everything that we can do to help people both articulate it to themselves, isn't it? It's like, feels like that's number one, as well as articulate to others. You also mentioned some people wrote it down. Did you mean that you read it out or they read it out?
I've offered to read out somebody else's if they just couldn't bear the thought of speaking in front of others. Again, it's a way of making this really accessible to everyone who has something to share, which is everyone. But actually, just for some people, it just gave them confidence to have it written down so they knew what they were going to say. And sometimes they stayed exactly on script, and sometimes they veered from that. Sometimes they wanted me to look at it in advance. Sometimes people sent me something and said, would it be okay for me to share this? And you know, again, it's just enabling people to be able to take up the opportunity. But yeah, I meant really that people felt if I've written out my testimony, then I won't stumble on my words, or I won't feel anxious about that. But I think something else that I didn't say is that it's actually celebrating the small things as well. If people share something like, I don't know, my dog was feeling sick and they got better, or I'm trying to think of a small one. Even, you know, I had a birthday this week. Yes. Great. That's the faithfulness of God to you. You've seen his faithfulness in bringing you to this point. So, you know, there's always, don't kind of despise the day of small things as well. I would say that the small things are to be really celebrated too.
Great.
Okay. Well, anything else, anyone, or shall we? Yeah. Say goodbye now.
Bye, Hazel. Lovely to see you. Probably time to go, I would think, as it looks like that might be it. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming along.
I think